What do you get when you connect Pokemon, Heroes of Might and Magic 3, and Darkest Dungeon? Well, of course Primal Frey. That's what you thought too, right guys? Anyhow, Primal Frey doesn't really exist yet, but let's at least try to make it a reality, shall we? I'm Timothy, and let me welcome you on this game-making journey. Let's begin. If you haven't figured it out already, we're making a turn-based strategy game. That's because thinking of using proper moves and planning is fun, I think at least, preceding Pokemon through the use of effectiveness and various elements. In Darkest Dungeon, it happens through the choice of targeting enemies with different spells and with prioritizing one over another. Overall, I think turn-based strategy gameplay is really interesting as it focuses more on thinking and less on reflexes. But before we begin coding, I would like to introduce you to one more fun element, which is lacking in previous games. Can you guess what it is? It is movement, of course. I love choosing spells and attacks, but I like walking even more. So let's add that. My favorite type of movement is again turn-based. I think it's done great in Heroes of Might and Magic 3, where you traverse the hexagonal grid. It allows for various tactics, protecting your archers in the corner, kiting enemies with fast units, or generally running around and making all kinds of strategic shenanigans. It's even more fun if we add some terrain adjustments to the grid so that you have to traverse around them. On a quick note, if you are wondering why the hexagonal grid and not just the chessboard grid, so based on the squares, there are a few advantages of the hexagonal grid. It's way more flexible. It allows for smoother movement, as a distance of 3 is equal exactly 3 in all directions. In case of a square-based grid, not so much. If you try to walk diagonally, the distance isn't ever equal, so you have to correct it. If you want to see an in-depth analysis of different grid types and their advantages, I recommend to you a video by CGP Grey, who covered this topic pretty well, I think. It's in the description. Okay, that's enough theory for now. Let's focus on making something. I wanted to start with the grid, as I had something specific in mind. I wanted to use pixel art to create cute and rememberable enemies on smallest grid possible. I wanted to use simple colors and silhouettes to convey all the messages I wanted to the player and make him focus on the strategy more than the clutter on the screen. I also wanted to make it orthographic, so it isn't as flat as in Heroes. The game itself is pretty, but while you focus on a grid which doesn't really convey perspective, it isn't that great. I think the units seem to fall off of it a little bit as it was flat as a wall. Anyway, I didn't really analyze what I'm doing enough and I just began trying. What's most important, I didn't think about angle of the whole grid. So here you can see that as a whole it looks quite nice, but individual hexes don't really look like hexes. Also, I am afraid that it's way too small. If you try to paint some cool guy on top of it, you really just can't, unless you're going for something really small, which I don't think I would like. So I made the grid bigger. I kept the straight lines and the horizontal edges, which clarify the hexes a little more. Also, I made it in form of building blocks, which I can then use to construct maps with by adding or taking them from the islands. It looks like this. It's pretty simple, but I quite like the aesthetic. We have to check if the grid is big enough to populate it with enemies though. So I created this crustacean-like crab warrior, I guess. He's cool, maybe too cute and not scary enough. I don't know, but there is certainly enough space for us to make something happen here, so that's good enough for now. I want to say that I enjoy this levitating aesthetic. I didn't plan for it, but now when I see it, I think it's quite cool. It will also allow for some cool terrain manipulation during combat. Maybe you can destroy or add hexes. You could try to strand enemies far from you so they can't reach you, or maybe build a bridge. I would like to incorporate such dynamic movement ideas later. It seems much more complex than just basic walking or flying. Now let's experiment with the tiles more. These are nice, but too simple for my taste. Let's add detail. These are too complex. All these strands of loose grass contribute to visual clutter. Maybe I can make something in between. I removed the grass and now something is missing. These aren't really good for anything. Maybe the problem is the amount of height the tiles have. If I make them flatter, they will maybe look cleaner, and that's way better. I also think the flatter tiles suit the game better, not being too blocky. Little strands of grass aren't too much now. Also, tiles are a little bit bigger, so there is way more space to breathe and to add maybe bigger creatures with more detail. So let's add some elevation and water and cute little mushrooms. I think it looks way better, don't you think? It starts to look like game even. So now when I have some space to make this little guy comfortable, let's make him walk. And maybe snap his claws. Isn't he cute? I like the way he attacks. I'm not sure if he will stay in the game, but he will suit us for now. Of course, I will need him to go into other directions too, but for now it's not necessary. I would like to focus on the maps and especially a map generator. I don't want to craft maps by hand, I want them to be procedurally generated, so they present a different challenge every time. I just want to change various parameters such as size or how spread up a map is. This will allow for dynamic gameplay, where map generation is additional stimulus that makes you think and adjust. Furthermore, if I want another biome, I will just tell the generator to make the map more rocky, and it will happen on its own. So let's export some tiles and bring the project to Unity. If you haven't programmed anything yourself, what I most recommend is starting in small steps. That way you can fix small problems one at a time and not deal with all of them at once. So using that logic, I want to start with generating just a hex grid of a given size. Nothing more. I will just give it a parameter of let's say 10 and the grid should generate 10 by 10. To do it, I had to shift every other row for hexes to align properly, but now pretty quickly I made my base working. Now, I want to generate islands on the grid, so the grid is just the base for me to generate a map on, and it determines the size of a map. I will start with a hexagonal island of given size, and I will place it in the middle of the grid. So I start by choosing the point which is in the middle. In this case it's this one. From that I try to calculate the island size. If it's given 1 for example, then it will check if the adjacent tiles are at most 1 distance from its origin. So in this case these 6 tiles should generate and others shouldn't. If I increase the number to 2, then of course the island will be bigger. And it isn't working. Nope. Okay, so I got it figured out. The main issue was connected with shifting rows. If we highlight all the hexes with x value 0, 1, 2, etc., we will get such a look. So if we want to calculate distance, cannot just calculate the x and the y difference. Let's say we want to calculate distance from this hex to one of the top ones. In both cases, y difference is 1. However, x difference will be different. In one case it will be 0, in the other 1. The sum of differences is now 1 and 2, meaning our island won't generate on the latter hex. So I had to write some smart code which subtracts this difference depending on the place on the grid and even parity. Now it works. Using the same method, I will now generate other smaller islands around it. I can change their number and size difference compared to the main island using a variable. So if I make it 1, then all the islands will be the same size, the small ones and the big one. If I make it like half, then there will be half the size of the main island. Great! Now let's randomize it a bit so it isn't as exact. Awesome! You can see that when we choose just the right parameters, it starts to look cool. If we overdo it, then the whole grid is a mess. If we make the parameter too small, then these are just big hexes. But you can already see that playing with these variables allows us to make some pretty stuff. Okay guys, we're coming to a close now. It's time for us to do all the pretty stuff. I will add it the same way. Let's say I'm starting with rocks. I will try to generate an island using the same rules as before, giving it size and randomness. Then I will check if it is on the main land. So you can imagine that I'm first generating mainland, then generating a rocky island of sorts. And I check if it's on the mainland or in the void. If it's on the mainland, I let it stay. If it's in the void, I erase it and try again. That way, all the rocks spawn on the already generated land, on the islands, not in the space. Let's go. So here's elevation. You can see what I was talking about a second ago. So all the rocks are generating properly. And now it's time for water. That's pretty, don't you think? In this case, I had to check one more thing. If the water is adjacent to the edge of the island, then I will have to make it grass, so the water doesn't just float in space. Maybe later I will make it to change the waterfall, which falls down from the map, but now I'm too lazy for that. But if you think it would be cool, just Let me know in the comments. Finally, it's time for foliage, bushes, mushrooms, etc. I consider grass and mushrooms to be purely decorative, so you can stand on the hexes where they generate, while the bush will be a natural blockade. You will have to destroy it to get through it. I can already see the strategic depth of this system. The map influences the strategy a lot, since you can have a tight choke point you can block or a distant island you can potentially use to shoot from. I plan to give the primals, so like the Pokemons let's say, I will call them primals, different movement abilities and attacks so they can use the map creatively. I mentioned before, generating hexes, destroying hexes, teleport, setting hexes on fire, etc. But that's for another video. For now, all I wanted to do is done, and all there is left is to play with the generator and see some cool generations. For now, I'm having tremendous fun with the project so far, so if you're interested in what I'm doing here, there is a big chance that more is coming. See you guys next time.